Okay, so there's a certain kind of collective consciousness, I guess, that I'm interested in, and that today I'm going to try to talk about. I would otherwise talk about this in the language of the renewal of the God image, so the renewal of the sort of direct sense of the religious, divine, or sacred, as experienced in, I would call states of collective awareness. And again, I'm going to try to talk about that. I'm going to try to describe some of the particular qualities. And that's obviously difficult to say the least. And so to do that, I'm going to try to execute what I would call a basic substitution. So I'm going to be taking 2 pages, actually 3 or 4 pages of material from a certain little book called Maps of Meaning, namely pages 96 and 7, which describe the distinctive properties of cognitive models through George Lakoff. And the substitution is to regard those cognitive models, quote unquote, as collective consciousness, or you could say as the reborn God. And I realize that that is going to be off-putting to some people, and that's okay. So let's see if I can successfully point to what I mean. Another way to talk about this, just briefly, is that I've talked in terms of this sort of Gnostic prophecy. One becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. From the third comes the one as the fourth, which sort of implies the sort of fulfillment of alchemical and Gnostic sort of goals. And yeah, it's that particular relationship between sort of the archetypes of three and four, which in Heidegger is presence in place, uh, that I feel is interesting and important. Sort of the relationship between the logos and the void is another way to talk about it, or between the human and nature. But again, I don't know if that really added anything. It's probably more confusing. But I have to try and talk about this in some kind of language. And today, it's in the language of maps of meaning. So I'm going to start with page 93 and try to convey some of the context in which this particular discussion of what Peterson calls cognitive models is coming. So on page 93, he says, our capacity for abstraction allows us to derive the constituent elements of successful adaptation itself from observation of behavioral patterns that are constantly played out in the world as it actually exists. Okay, so he's talking about the way that our adaptivity is embodied, is built into our behavior, right? And so here, adaptivity could be treated as synonymous to relevance realization or collective consciousness in the form that I'm trying to talk about. It's also akin to presence. So this the source of fittedness or adaptability, but it's not quite the right term, but it's in that direction, right? So the idea is that we watch our behavior and that we abstract about that on top of that. So what is already being pointed to is this deep looping. It's a looping process between that which is abstract within us and that which is more embodied. Quote, the behavioral patterns that constitute adult interaction, for example, are exceedingly sophisticated and are conditioned to the last gesture by centuries of cultural work. We can extract images of these patterns. Such images, just as sophisticated as the behaviors they represent, constitute the building blocks for our stories and for our self-understanding. So already he's bringing in essentially the imagination, the imaginal, our capacity for image creation. Again, he's talking about this mediating feedback loop between, you could call different faculties, but it's more like, that's not quite the right word for it either. It's like the way that we behave, assuming we do, in a way that is constitutive of adaptation or presence, that can be constitutive of presence, and then the images that we can make about that, the stories that we tell about those images, and then the sort of abstractions and self-understanding, the self-reflective consciousness that is built out of that process. It's not something that's built, it's something that's there from the beginning within the behavior itself and is then elaborated into those different forms in a way that often actually takes away from the deepest sense that we have of the collective consciousness, collective awareness that I'm trying to point to. It's a little bit of a misnomer. What I mean is a kind of, it's in a sense a group derived state of, it's not exactly a state either, of awareness that is properly speaking in a way derived from a dynamic feedback loop or opponent processing reciprocal opening between individual and collective forms of consciousness. But I just said collective awareness or reborn God because it's just easier to put it that way. Sorry. He gives an example. He says, the admirable adult, an identifiable individual, keeps her house tidy and neat, reconciles her warring brothers, and learns hard moral lessons when such learning is necessary. The archetypal hero makes order out of chaos, brings peace to the world, and restructures society when it's become rigid and anachronistic. So again, he's talking about an embodied pattern of adaptability or adaptivity that is built into both our self-reflective understanding, our stories, including but not limited to stories of the hero, obviously deriving from our behavior. Quote, the collective unconscious that constitutes the basis for shared religious mythology is, in fact, the behavior, the procedures that have been generated, transmitted, imitated, and modified by everyone who's ever lived everywhere. So here there's a profound and deep connection between the collective unconscious, the body, and embodiment, and sort of memetics as connected with adaptivity. So the collective unconscious, properly conceived in this way, is something that arises from out of, in a way, our embodied being in the world. It's not an abstract idea, it's something that we live from out of. Quote, images of these behaviors and of the transcendent place where they occur, the universe of chaos and order, constitute metaphors, symbolic images. Again, so we have these adaptive patterns of behavior and we make images out of them. Those images are here identified as metaphors. There's something inherently metaphorical, or indeed what we could call simply symbolic about those images. Because it should be understood here that they don't only represent those behaviors, they facilitate our participation in those patterns of adaptivity. Which means that those symbolic images are not, in a way, derivative, but in fact constitutive of that adaptivity. So again, we see the profound importance of the image of the symbol to our awareness. It being understood that there's a deep connection between our adaptivity, our presence, relevance realization, self-realization, and awareness. Okay, again, this is all context building. So he says, metaphors mediate between our procedural wisdom and our explicit knowledge. They constitute the imagistic, declarative point of transition between the act and the word. Between the act and the word. So again, the idea is that this is more of me, right? That there is collective consciousness, or you could just say God. There is God that can be enacted. that can be enacted. And also, there is the word. And here we understand that there's a deep connection between language, right, as an act, and the word, the logos, prophetic philosophy, revelation, and metaphor and image and symbol. Because these kinds of behaviors that are properly mediating, they occupy this space between, which is both. It's both imagistic and linguistic and procedural and enacted at the same time. Simply put, symbols mediate conscious and unconscious. Where it should be understood that consciousness, capitalized, deified, is different than conscious and unconscious. And it's sort of this, again, this feedback loop between conscious and unconscious is the same as the feedback loop between 3 and 4 that I was mentioning earlier. And it's from the point of view of consciousness, it's by deriving patterns of adaptivity from out of the unconscious and up into the conscious half of us. It's by doing that that we become self-conscious, self-aware. There's some little tangles in there, but I won't get tangled into them. We'll keep going. So he builds more context. He says, we've spent hundreds of thousands of years watching ourselves act and telling stories about how we act. A good story has a universal quality, which means that it speaks a language we all understand. I can't quite say the same here. Any universally comprehensible language, universally comprehensible, it must have universal reference. And this means that a good story must speak to us about those aspects of experience that we all share. But what is it that every human being shares, regardless of place and time of birth? That's what we're attempting to point to here. The idea is that there is one story that has never been told. That there could be the best story ever that hasn't yet been told. And that it refers to that which all humans share, which we can simply call God. The idea being that we haven't realized that yet. We haven't realized that in both senses of the word. Continuing, quote, is it reasonable to posit that anything might remain constant, for example, across the centuries that separate us from our Stone Age ancestors, across the ideological and religious barriers that divide the inhabitants of our modern nations? The idea being, yes, it is reasonable to propose something. Our distant predecessors lived much closer to nature, and the problems that beset them seem far removed from our current daily struggles. They're not. Again, the idea here is that we're actually in profound and deep connection with nature right now, and that it's constituting our self-awareness in a way that we haven't realized. It's the same thing, realizing that in a sense that we haven't changed, that we still haven't realized that which we are. Quote, the great difference between us and them seems analogous in distance, if not precisely in kind, to that obtaining between the varied cultural worlds of today. So it seems like we have a different culture. The idea being, again, that the differences are there and real, but there are profound underlying similarities that haven't yet been realized. So he talks about the gap that separates the Hindu religious mystic from the Manhattan investment banker. Quote, it's not surprising that a world characterized by such different human lives remains rife with constant intergroup conflict. So again, the awareness of these profound differences as the source of rivalry, as the source of conflict in the world, leading to meta-crisis dynamics. Nor is it surprising that we might seem to have outgrown our traditional wisdom. That is quite surprising. We haven't outgrown our traditional wisdom, and indeed we need more of it. But are there fundamental presuppositions and not just presuppositions, but that which we participate in all together, that we might agree upon and share despite our differences. Well, that's what we need to point to, and that's what I'm trying to point to here. So what's revealed is that it's a fundamental kind of awareness. It's a sense that we have, that we don't realize that we have. Quote, most objects of experience have some properties in common. You just refer to the one and be done with it, but while varying in regard to others. Yeah, so generally the similarities and the differences are both significant. So it is with individuals and with cultures. We seem peculiarly aware of our differences, however, and not of our similarities. I would say that the reason for that is because once the group context is assumed, then it becomes adaptive to orient to the differences, to try to position oneself within the group. Because again, as per not E.O. Wilson, but David Sloan Wilson, cooperation makes the best group, but within the groups, competition wins. And the reason for the adaptivity of competition within groups, that's what leads to our fundamental awareness of differences, for example, because that's one contributing factor at least. So the idea is that the awareness of the differences presupposes the existing unity of the group, but then proceeds to undermine it, with the result that we deeply need unity. We need to become reliably conscious of the state that we all share. We need to become reliably conscious of the state that we all share. Again, you can just say the groundless ground and move on, but it's like I said, reliably conscious, not in proposition. Quote, even groups of people who share much in common, at least from the perspective of more distant outsiders, like the Irish Catholics and Protestants, these appear sufficiently conscious of those factors that make them unique in their social affiliation. As he says, I think this is in part because we're not built to focus on the predictable and the familiar. Our attention naturally gravitates toward those aspects of our environment, natural and social, that contain information, that which changes, that which is new. The similarities of the Serb and the Croat are hidden from each other, so to speak, by a wall of habituation, but the differences stand out profoundly. JP continues, quote, to ask the question, quote, what is it that two or more discriminable beings or things or situations might share? What is it that all situations share? What is it that all things share? What is it that all beings share? To ask that question is really to ask, quote, at what levels of analysis might two or more things be considered the same? And at what levels different? So the idea is that putting it in the level of analysis is terrible, but there is one level of analysis at which we're all the same. And we're trying to become more conscious or more aware of that in a way that doesn't, in a way that isn't totalizing in a monotheistic way. I'll leave that aside and we'll continue. Quote, what unites us is the fact of those particulars, however, the fact that we each have a specific time and place, and the implications of that fact for the nature of our existence. I would call this incarnation. Quote, our lives are open to possibility, but remain eternally bound by disease, death, and subjugation to social structure. As mutable, limited social beings, we're all engaged in a massive, cooperative, and competitive endeavor. We do not understand the rules that govern this endeavor in the final analysis, and we can't state explicitly why it is we do what we do. Our democratic institutions, for example, which contain the most fundamental axioms of the body of law that we imitate, that governs our behavior, are inextricably embedded in the conception of natural rights, which is to say, in a statement of faith, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, so he's just sort of talking more about what our situation actually is, and the fact that we've never been able to sort of state explicitly what we're doing, and that actually isn't what language is for. The idea would be to reorient the word in a profound and deep way, so as not to explain or explicate what we do, but to enact more, let's say, more consciousness, although there's problems with putting it that way too. I'm going to continue here. He says, we are all in consequence imitating a story that we don't understand. This story, which I would call the eternal story, covers the broadest possible expanse of time and space. At least that expanse relevant to us. And is still implicitly contained in our behavior, although represented in part in episodic imagery and semantic description. Okay, so what he's saying here, the important point here, is that we fundamentally haven't fully told that story. So all the stories that we tell, we haven't realized them yet. We're still imitating a story that we don't understand. We haven't escaped we haven't gotten rid of the need for the traditional wisdom that we've left behind. We're actually still bound and in relationship to nature right now. And we're not realizing that. The idea being that we could be if we reoriented our aim. Quote, this partially implicit containment in image and semantics as well as behavior constitutes our mythology and our ritual. Quote, and provides the upper level unconscious frames of reference within which our conditional and expressible individual stories retain their validity. So what he's pointing to is that whatever individual story we have and that we're telling about ourselves, about who we are, whatever individual story we have, is grounded in this collective level of shared mythology, shared story, which is implicit in our image, in our semantics as well, in the sense of we hold these truths to be self-evident. And we're still unconscious of that fundamentally. So the implication would be, and we see this through Christianity and so on, that we've become, in a way, recently more conscious of the individual aspect of our stories, but that we have yet to become more conscious at a collective level. It's why I was emphasizing collective consciousness, although it shouldn't be understood that I'm only talking about the collective angle. I'm talking about both. So it would seem to be the case that it is through our archetypal mythic categories that we become conscious as a collective unity. Let me say a bit more of what I mean by that with reference to what JP says. He says, quote, it is impossible to properly appreciate the nature of the categories of the mythological imagination without some understanding of the process of categorization. Okay, so here we have the imperative, right? The idea is that there is a collective awareness that we embody, that we inhabit, that structures our sense of who we are, that we have not fully realized, that we express in the form of mythology, ritual, story, image, and semantics, that it would be good to realize more of. That we can do that, and that it helps if we understand better exactly what the qualities of this awareness that we inhabit are. That's what I'm trying to point to. And here he's saying that if we want to understand, again, quote, these categories of the mythological imagination, that we have to understand categorization. So there's a bit that's contained in that I just have to say that like there's a way that this mythology, it presupposes the existence of category and it presupposes the existence of character and of imagination. all of which are already quite profound. So I can't just reference a whole bunch of other work, but I'm drawing from a whole playlist on human origins that talked about the origins of human culture as fundamentally the ability to sort of, in a way, collect knowledge from the natural world, to organize it into category structures, and to reorganize the boundaries between those categories iteratively over time. And that's actually exactly the same as the managing the ongoing relationships between categories of the mythological imagination, because those primordial, fundamental, ancient mythological categories are derived from and based in the family, the group. Categories like mother and father and child. Hence, it's important to appreciate the relationship between the nature of the categories of the mythological imagination and categorization itself. And this is how I get to talk about, eventually, in a little while, cognitive models in terms of what I'm calling the reborn God. But again, that's just a bit provocative. So I'm going to keep going here with what Peterson is saying. Only a couple more paragraphs. He says, the act of categorization, here understood as like really deep to what it means to be human, not just categorizing, but renegotiating categories, not just boxing, but updating those boxes. Quote, enables us to treat the mysterious and complex world we inhabit as if it were simpler, as if it were in fact comprehensible. We perform this act of simplification. It's actually a dialectic between complexification and simplification, but I'm leaving that to the side to read what he's saying. We perform this act of simplification by treating objects or situations that share some aspect of structure, function, or implication, again, as if they were identical. So it's metaphor, to act as if one thing is another thing, because it's simpler that way. This is the function of metaphor. It's efficient. Quote, people are very good at categorizing, so good, in fact, that the ability is taken for granted and appears simple. It's not so simple, however. Neither the rules that underlie categorization nor the act itself have proved easy to describe. So we're about to quote from Roger Brown, an eminent psycholinguist, on the topic of categories. What I've said about this is that the social maintenance of functional categorization is the key to the mythic imagination and also the key to ritual practice, which is really just a way of reiterating what I already said. And so the idea here through people like Corbin, for example, would be that there's something here about re-inhabiting our membership, or you could say our godhood in these archetypal mythic categories, becoming those categories through the mythic imagination and ritual practice. And from out of those categories, relating to what you could call the groundless ground, or the ground of being, or simply the void. But it's that which is beyond void, right? So what I'm talking about are certain affordances in terms of the self-maintenance or the social maintenance of awareness, you could say collective consciousness, that come about as a result of the capacity to imaginally inhabit different mythological identities. So we're about to talk a little bit more about categories and the way that they're semi-permeable. Category is another way to talk about them being similar to archetypes or gods, you could say. Let's quote from Roger Brown, who states, until about 1973, psychological experiments on category formation conceived of human categories on the model of a proper set. Triangles are a proper set, which means that members of the triangle class are precisely definable in terms of a conjunction of attributes, true of all members of the set and of no non-members. A triangle is a closed three-sided figure. From the fact that a clear definition exists, it follows that membership in the set is not a matter of degree. One triangle is no more essentially a triangle than any other. An entity either is or is not a triangle. This is a dumb way of talking about categories, I would say, because our social categories are not like that at all. For example, there is a way in which a penguin kind of is a bird, but it's not really a bird. It's kind of a crappy bird. I mean, I love penguins and all, but there are better birds than penguins. Like maybe technically, but not quite functionally. A penguin, a bird. Okay, Roger Brown continues. In retrospect, it's amazing that psychology was for so long able to think of real life categories as proper sets. He's agreeing with me. He's saying we ought to have warred or worried more. Yeah, worried. We ought to have worried more over the extreme difficulty everyone has in defining anything natural. And natural, as used here, includes not only dogs and carrots, but also artifacts like chairs, cars, and pencils. I know you can tell one when you see one, but just try listing the attributes that are true of all dogs and no cats, or wolves or hyenas, or of all the carrots and no radishes or turnips, or of all the chairs and no small tables, hassocks, benches, or slings. So he's talking about the semi-permeability of categories, which is to say that their groundedness in phenomenology and pragmatics, rather than in, let's call it logic or objective truth. Okay, now finally, we're going to shift from categories and their semi-permeability as constitutive of the sort of mythic and mythological categories that ended up being called archetypes or gods. And we're going to talk about cognitive models in this context that I've created. Peterson states, in the natural state, so to speak, human beings do not think like logicians or even like empiricists. It takes training to think like that. In the absence of such training, we still think, however, but more subjectively. It's not quite right either. Like we think more subjectively like unreasonable, quote unquote, idiosyncratically emotional beings who inhabit bodies of particular size with particular and constrained properties. Just elaborating. Our natural categories, which are the groupings we generate spontaneously, do not consist solely of the consensually apprehensible properties shared by the things and situations we encounter. They're more than that. Neither are natural categories tightly bounded. Their borders are fuzzy and they overlap. The construction of proper sets is possible, obviously, since they exist. And the ability to construct and use such sets has proved useful in a broad variety of manners. Nonetheless, the capability that underlies such construction appears relatively new, phylogenetically speaking, and seems dependent, at least in part, on the ability to think empirically and to regard things objectively. He just finishes that off by saying, in the absence of such ability, which requires specialized training, or at least immersion in a culture like ours, where such thinking has become commonplace, quote, people naturally incline toward the development of what has been described recently as the cognitive model, quote unquote. Cognitive models are characterized by a number of distinctive properties, as paraphrased in part from George Lakoff. George Lakoff is the author of not only Metaphors We Live By and Philosophy in the Flesh, both of which were cited by Viveki far more recently. That's how I know him, on embodiment and metaphor and so on. But also the 1987 publication, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. What categories reveal about the mind? It's quite an interesting topic to discuss. Anyway, we're leaving the... Okay, so now where are we? So now what I want to say is that there is a kind of what's called here a cognitive model. It's a relationship between what you could call nature and culture, or presence and place. Sorry, it would be culture and nature, presence and place, or three and four, archetypes of three and four, or conscious and unconscious. There is a certain feedback loop going on there. And it's something that we naturally tend toward and that we worked out how to do partly, that we've largely forgotten, or that we haven't realized that we're still doing it, and that we, in a way, need more of. So there's a way of taking our consciousness, what awareness we have, and investing it somewhere that we've forgotten to invest it, namely in the process that gave rise to that consciousness in the first place. And I've been talking about this in terms of remembering, recovering the capacity to inhabit, to perspectively take up participation in different archetypal categories and to relate to that which grounds them. But here, what I want to do is talk about the rebirth of God, or what you could call group-derived states of, you could just say collective consciousness, but that seems a bit weak. Collective awareness that could be, what am I saying about that? I'm saying there's a way that it's something that we're already doing, and there's a way that if we more consciously participate in that process, then there's a way that it can be, I would say, upregulated. And so the substitution that I want to perform here is that JP through George Lakoff is about to talk about cognitive models, which are what we naturally incline to. And I think this is another way of talking about the kinds of collective awareness that I'm attempting to talk about. And that's why I think the substitution is worthwhile. So where he says, he then gives, this is page 96 and 7, and he gives 6 different qualities which describe cognitive models that are quite long. And he says, they are characterized, they are embodied, and so on. So the idea would be to substitute the term they as collective awareness and substitute cognitive model as reborn God and see what that reveals in the meaning. So I'm now going to go through those 6 different qualities. With my reading, which says collective, and this is something that can be oriented to and participated in more than it is being in consciously speaking. So he says collective awareness is embodied with regard to its content. Actually, you have to go more slowly. So he's saying that cognitive models are embodied with regard to their content, which essentially means that they can be used or inhabited without necessarily being defined. They're implicit in action without necessarily being explicit in description. Quote, 2 things classified within the same cognitive model are 2 things that evoke the same behavior and can therefore be regarded, at least from the perspective of action, as one thing. So one way to put this would be the cognitive model that we're all inhabiting. Quote, if you're utilizing a cognitive model and someone asks you to describe its content, what makes a dog? You might say, I can't say, but I know when one is around. For example, you know that the dog is friendly, something to be patted, something to play with. Although such knowledge does not constitute everything that makes up what you regard as dog. Most of the concepts you use are in fact embodied at the most basic levels. Habitual, procedural, motoric, and behavioral. You can use them without thinking. Those that are not can only be applied slowly and with full conscious attention and with effort. So what I'm referring to here is the way that there's a kind of collective awareness which we actually already embody, that we're not present to, but we're not present to that fact. And I'm trying to disclose or point to that in a way which is apparently quite technical, and it's difficult, obviously. That was the first quality. So it's embodied. It's something that we're already embodying. We're already doing this in a way. It's enacted as well as embodied and embedded and extended. Next, he says of cognitive models that they're characterized by basic level categorization and basic level primacy. So to me, this is about relevance realization, right? He's talking about that we identify cat before Siamese and cat before mammal because it's more relevant. So again, not only our cognitive models, but what I take to be this collective awareness that we're already within right now is oriented toward or is relevance realization is one way to talk about it. I think that's clear. So I'm going to move to the next one. So I would talk in that context, referring to sort of basic level categorization and basic level primacy, like the example that I just gave. This is about the affordances that unlocks. It's about our relationship with the world, not only the salience landscape, right, of the way that things shine forth to us, but what that makes possible, who we regard ourselves to be, and what we regard the world to be, what is available to us, is defined and constituted by these basic level categorizations. Hence, there's a way that if we regard these basic level categorizations as structuring the agent arena relationship in Viveki's terms, then orienting towards this, what I've called collective consciousness, is a way also orienting towards unity between one and many. Because there's an identity that is assigning many categories, many things within categories. And there's also the one that we are doing that, the identity that we've assumed in doing that, one and many. And it's realizing that that's what we're doing right now. Okay, so we've talked about embodiment, we've talked about basic level categorization. I'm going to talk about four more qualities. The third of six is, quote, they, cognitive models, may be used in metonymic or reference point reasoning. Quote, metonymic reasoning is symbolic in the psychoanalytic or literary sense. Metonymic means interchangeable and more. The fact that objects in a cognitive model have metonymic properties means that any or all of those objects can stand for any or all of the others. This capacity makes sense since all of the objects in a given category are by definition regarded as equivalent in some non-trivial sense. More generally, in terms of implication for action. The human capacity for metaphor, aesthetic appreciation, and allusion seems integrally related to the capacity for metonymic reasoning and the use of richly meaningful cognitive models. Yeah, so I would talk about this again in terms of relevance realization, but it's more like symbolic reasoning. It's more like interchangeability. This awareness that we are, right? That I'm saying that we're not aware that we are, in a way. We're not conscious of the fact that there's something that we're doing that is structuring our awareness, and we could be. We take it to all situations. We take it everywhere, and so there's a way that it's the importance of it being symbolic is that the meaning of objects is in a way interchangeable. Metonymic reasoning is symbolic. In a way, it's symbolic reasoning. It's the quality of associative thought, like knowing by association. It's allowing something to stand for something else. So I would say it has to do with the quality of everything being interlinked. It's a network quality. Metonymic reasoning also refers to the way that these category structures, let's say that there's one category or cognitive model that we inhabit. Well, from out of that cognitive model, we categorize in the basic level way that we were just talking about. And those category structures are interchangeable. So, for example, obstacles and tools, they're relevant to all contexts in a way, all situations. And this is deeply tied to our capacity for metaphor, for metonymic reasoning, because it's allowing things to stand as if they're something else, to fit into the place of something else. So I would say that this metonymic reasoning that we've been talking about is a looping process that has to do with context independence, meaning context variability, being able to the fact that our awareness can fit into multiple different situations, in fact, all different situations, all different contexts, and also context specificity, meaning awareness of aesthetic appreciation. So the awareness of the complexity, of the subtlety, of the texture, of the way that things are. Importantly, so it's quite complex, this one about metonymic reasoning, because so much is implied by metonymic reasoning. I've talked about networking, I've talked about interlinkage, I've talked about, yeah, I've talked about um, metaphorical reasoning. I've talked about um, sort of knowing by association, the interchangeability of contexts, but also context specificity. And then finally, allusion, meaning to allude to something. So I would call this a sort of indirect reference to the implicit, which is tied to meaning. So there's a way that the meaning of what we say is always referring to that which is going on, that which is implied, always implied by what we say. That's literally the meaning of what we say. It constitutes that. So what I'm tying together there is meaning, illusion, and the implicit. And there's a kind of self-referential feedback loop that what we say, and indeed the categories that we apply, ultimately always derive from and point back to that which we are. Okay, I've described three of the different qualities of cognitive models that I think can be reasonably substituted with collective awareness that we are, that we're not noticing that we are. And I've talked about embodiment, basic level categorization or relevance realization, could say, and also metonymic reasoning involving symbol, knowing by association, and the implicit, as well as context sensitivity and interdependence or independence. Quote, now I'm going to describe the three other qualities. The first of which is quite short. It says they, cognitive models, are characterized by membership and centrality gradients. Okay, so that's degrees of membership, like I was saying with penguins. So he talks about how an ostrich is a bird, but not as much of a bird as a robin. So something can be a better or worse exemplar of its category. And if it's worse, it can still be placed within that category. So this is what he means by centrality gradients. Okay, so how would this apply to collective awareness? So I think what I would say is that the way that our vision is structured with the fovea and then sort of fading toward the periphery, right? That is an embodied analogy of the way that consciousness is structured. I don't think consciousness is a kind of even plane. I think it fades. I think I would say that this collective awareness that we are is also, yeah, that's because that was about individual consciousness, right? And I think that holds. But I think the same thing is true of this state of collective awareness that I'm arguing that we're still, again, that is implicit in everything that we say and do, that we don't notice. And so I think noticing that would entail moving in a way, moving closer toward, moving deeper into membership within that, and moving closer toward the center of that, which is in a way like moving toward the center of this awareness that we are, is in a way becoming more conscious of that which we are. So it's like, again, if there's a category, right? But there, you can be more within or to the edge of that category. Well, imagine the cognitive model that we are in a way. Again, that's through what's that famous neuroscientist guy's name? That it's not that we have a model, that we are a model. The point is we can be closer to the center or not, the center being consciousness itself. Okay, two other qualities and then I'll stop. The fifth is that cognitive models contain phenomena associated with as a consequence of familial resemblance, family resemblance, which comes through Wittgenstein. Yeah, so things with familial resemblance all share similarities with a potentially hypothetical object. So again, it's like a bunch of different brothers and they all share similar qualities, but they none of whom all has all of the prototypical qualities. Right? That's a pretty basic idea, really. So if you saw them in a group, you would say those men are all related. Okay, so the idea here is that that point of centrality, that foveal point of collective awareness, is empty. It's like the eye of the hurricane. It's like, yeah, the eye of the tornado. It's there's a void in the middle of all of everything. And we can orient and move toward that, and in so doing, move further along the centrality gradients toward the center, or more faithfully embody that which we all have family resemblance to. Okay, so this cognitive model or this awareness that we are, again, it contains phenomena which are associated as a consequence of familial resemblance. So it's pointing to something that we are contained by, I would say, that we are within. And again, in a way, it's the implicit context or situation, but it's not just a situation, it's more than that too. It's all situations that we're all in right now, that we've all been in the whole time, that we could be more conscious of that, more intentionally, iteratively aware as that. And there's one final quality, which is that cognitive models give rise to the phenomenon of polysemy, which is that it's a defining characteristic of myth. And a polysemic story is written and can be read validly on many levels, like the Quran, for example, read on multiple levels at the same time. So this is the idea that this awareness which we are gives rise to the phenomenon of these multiple levels and our awareness of those multiple levels. I'll describe what he says. He says, for example, the phenomenon of polysemy, discussed in some detail later in this book, arises when the relationship of objects within a particular cognitive model is analogous, in some sense, to the relationship that obtains between cognitive models. I would talk about alignment. So great works of literature are always polysemic in this manner. The characters within the story stand in the same relationship to one another as things of more general significance stand to one another in the broader world. Again, the characters within the story stand in the same relationship to one another as things of more general significance stand to one another in the broader world. He gives an example to try and explain this. The struggle of Moses against the Egyptian pharaoh, for example, can also be read as a struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor, or more generally, as the rebellion of the world destroying savior, as a rebellion of the savior against society. Complicated. The point is it gives rise to polysemy, which I would talk about it. Yeah, it's just in terms of multiple layers of meaning at the same time. Or no matter which world we inhabit. So again, the phenomenon of, let's say, the multiverse or all the different worlds, well, it's that which gives rise to all of them. So again, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to give the final paragraph that he gives to describe this. We talked about cognitive models by substitution with collective awareness that we could be more aware that we are. And being aware of its qualities help us to hone in on that. We talked about embodiment, basic level categorization in terms of relevance realization, metonymy or metonymic reasoning, which is basically symbolic or associational reasoning in regard to context specificity and context independence, involving sort of categorization up toward unity and independence and simplicity, and downward toward aesthetic appreciation and awareness of complexity, subtlety, and texture. Also in terms of meaning and the implicit, that which is always implicit. That was metonymy. That was the third thing. Then the three other qualities were the centrality gradients of group membership, that we can be closer to the center of the cognitive model that we are, which I would talk about as a normativity on consciousness and becoming consciousness. And then finally, familial resemblance. There's a void in the middle, basically. And polysemy, which is basically the multiple worlds hypothesis, essentially, that which gives rise to all worlds. Finally, Peterson says, to say that two separable things belong to the same category is a tricky business. We presume without thinking that we group things as a consequence of something about them, rather than a consequence of something about us. What do all chairs share in common then? Any given chair may lack some of the most common chair attributes, such as legs, backs, or armrests. Is a tree stump a chair? Yes, if you can sit on it. So what he's talking about is functional unity. So he's talking about a unity which is sort of the most pragmatic possible unity. It's kind of, I'm talking about the god of pragmatism, which is quite funny to say. So this isn't a quality that's really about an object considered as an independent thing that makes it a chair, that gives it an identity. It's rather something about its potential for interaction with us. So what's the best way to relate with things? What's the best way to relate with things such that functional unity is always the result? The category chair contains objects that serve a function we value. Quote, chairs may be efficiently sat on, at least potentially. Our action in the face of an object constitutes an elementary but fundamental form of classification. It constitutes, in fact, the most fundamental of all classifications, that from which all abstract divisions are derived. All right, so basically here, our action, yeah, so this is too complicated already. So there's a way that I'm going to stop with that. I'm going to say that all categories of use derive from a more underlying structural category that's oriented toward, in a way, functional unity. But it's like, is it enough? Do we categorize enough? And we not only confer categories in this way and identity, but we actually confer personhood. Our personhood is derived from our collective awareness in this way. Because something is given its individual identity as well as its group membership, its category membership, from out of our relevance realization, from out of our assigning of what something is. The most important application of this, I think, would be that All objects are dangerous when approached in one fashion, but beneficial when approached in another. So what this would unlock is a way of being aware from, as, and from out of, from out of the collective awareness that we are, such that the identities that we assign to very basic level categories would come available for reassignment, such that we could come into, I would call, win-win relationships, us and them together relationships with those very basic level categories that we are blind to inhabiting and that we project. So that would be basic level categorization and the affordances that it unlocks. The affordances unlocked by looking at basic level categorization from the point of view of that which precedes all of them. So I'll have to stop there. So that was difficult. Anyway, for what it's worth, I'll leave this be.